This week, it's meat, but not as you know it. From plant-based to slaughter-free, we'll look at the innovation hitting your dinner table.
If a meat replacement is truly going to be a replacement, then the company that's making it needs to make more than just burgers and sausages.
And it's not just meat, but seafood too. We'll look at the startup growing shrimp and crab in a lab to make food more ethical and environmentally friendly.
Our mission is to feed the 10 billion that we will be in the next couple of decades.
Plus, turning your beer green. We're not talking St. Patrick's Day, but the plans from Heineken and Brewdog to make the drinks industry more sustainable.
We are part of the race to zero. We are the first global brewer to make a commitment to fully decarbonize by 2040.
I'm Kaylee Lyons in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green. Demand for meat is skyrocketing. In the past 50 years, it's estimated that meat consumption has tripled. Some 60 billion animals are slaughtered every year for human consumption, and according to the UN, that's responsible for about 15% of all global greenhouse emissions. So what's the solution to make the meat industry more sustainable? Well, some firms are now looking to alternative sources of protein, like faux meats. Consulting firm Kearney thinks that the market for plant-based meat is set to grow to $450 billion by 2040. And while slaughter-free burgers have been around for a while, the next big push is into an American favorite, whole cuts.
3D printed steaks, bacon made from mushrooms, and fermented plant-based beef. Is this a taste of the future? For the past few years, plant-based burgers have dominated the space. Now there's a new focus, whole cuts.
So the burgers and the sausages have been hugely successful, I think more successful than anybody expected. But most Americans, when they want meat, they don't just want a burger or a sausage. They want like that chicken fillet, they want that steak, they want that pork chop. So if a meat replacement is truly going to be a replacement, then the company that's making it needs to make more than just burgers and sausages.
You know, it's easy to be popular when you serve your family steak.
But plants don't have muscle tissues or the bite and chewiness of meat. So how do you make a whole cut of meat out of plants? Well, Atlas Food has turned to mushrooms.
Nature's already created the most compelling plant-based alternatives to whole cuts of meat in the form of specialty mushrooms. We grow these specialty mushrooms that people eat and have eaten for hundreds of years, but we grow them very, very fast and in very large formats that make it easy for us to turn it into whole cut meat alternative products. It works really well because the taste and the texture of meat is really grown right into the agricultural product as it's growing.
Some companies like Redefine Meat are taking a more high-tech approach. It prints its whole-cut meat alternative.
We've broken down the composition of meat to what we call muscle, fat, and blood components, which are all plant-based. And we create them by taking natural ingredients and mixing them. And then we have a machine, which is basically a very large robot that knows how to place each and every one of them in a precise place according to a three-dimensional file. Then we have meat that is really tasty, but it's 3 years of development, 5 patents, and a lot of hard work.
Fermentation is yet another technology being used to create whole cuts.
We take plant raw materials like soy or pea or others, and we improve them by introducing microorganisms that metabolize those raw materials and change them and give them a new life, just like in the case of miso or soy sauce. We have a proprietary process in which we take that raw material and turn that into something that really resembles a whole cut with its fibrous texture, with its nutritional profile, with fat marbling, and with the general appearance of what a whole cut is.
Meat is a food that we all like, especially when it's tender and juicy and flavorful.
At this point, no company has shown that they can really make a whole cut of meat that on its own looks, tastes, and has that same texture and mouthfeel as an actual piece of meat. So there's a big if there. If they can do it, I think that will be the future of this industry.
My Bacon is currently available on a small scale, while whole cuts from redefined meat and chunk foods aren't yet on the market.
Coming up, meat isn't the only food source that companies are working to make more sustainable. We'll look at the startup that's using stem cells to grow its own seafood next. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lines, and this is Bloomberg Green. Let's get a roundup of all of the other green news you need to know this week with Jennifer Zabazaja. Jen.
Thanks, Kaylee. Here's everything you need to know in green this week. Skyrocketing carbon prices are giving fresh momentum to technology that captures and removes greenhouse gas emissions so they can be buried. Credit Suisse says the market for these tools could reach $2 trillion. The cost to release carbon has never been higher in Europe, and it's poised to keep increasing, creating a tipping point for the sector. Also, the UK government says hydrogen could be vital to efforts to change the way vehicles are fueled, factories are powered, and homes are heated. It's unveiled a strategy that aims to unlock £4 billion of investment in hydrogen production by 2030 by using similar incentives to those that helped boost the offshore wind industry. Government analysis suggests hydrogen could provide as much as a third of UK energy needs by the middle of the century. And finally, China is continuing to announce new steel mills and coal-fired power plants, even as it maps out a path to lower carbon emissions. According to the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, state-owned firms proposed 43 new coal-fired generators in the first half of 2021. If all approved and built, they would emit about 150 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja, and that's your Green Brief. Kaylee?
Thanks, Jen. The production of cultured meats is already beginning to spread worldwide. That is meat grown from cells. But there are also startups working on growing seafood from scratch, too. That's particularly important for coastal regions around the world that rely on the oceans for a major part of their diet. We caught up with one firm that's looking to grow its own shellfish.
These dumplings are made of real shrimp meat. But instead of being farmed in water tanks or rivers, this shrimp is grown in the lab by Singapore-based startup Shiok Meats.
Globally, we are the only company working on cell-based shrimp and crab. Since we are making this from the actual cells to the DNA level, the nutrition as well as the taste is exactly the same as the original product.
Around the world, startups like Shiok Meats are racing to invent and improve alternatives to traditional meat production, which is often criticized for environmental and ethical reasons.
The advantages of using cellular agriculture to make seafood is that you don't need to set up large-scale farms or go into the oceans to catch these animals for human consumption, so environmentally friendly. There is very less greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions as well, and it's animal friendly because we don't slaughter the animals in large scale.
Plant-based meats are already here. Alternative proteins from homegrown insects are on the way. And now, with advances in technology, cell-based seafood could soon be coming to a table near you.
I've been a vegetarian all my life for ethical, more environmental reasons. I just put my skill for biology and my love for food and my love for sort of saving this environment and doing my part in this world together and said, why not grow seafood using stem cells?
Cultured meat is not new. In 2013, Dutch professor Mark Post created the world's first burger patty from cells. So far, more than 60 companies have joined this field, backed by increasing funding from investors. And the cell-based meat market is projected to reach $140 billion in the next decade. cultured chicken developed by startup Eat Just was approved for commercial sale in Singapore last December, a first for a cultured meat product. But while many companies are working on cultured chicken, beef, and duck meat, Shiok focuses on seafood.
So shrimp, crab, and lobster alone makes about $150 billion worth of market share in the world. And Asia is the largest producer, consumer, and exporter of these proteins. And it's well liked by all of us, and we consume a lot of crustaceans. So the process of growing cell-based meat or seafood involves three main steps. The first step is where you isolate the stem cells from live animals. These are the source cells of any animal, sort of the birth cell that can grow into any organ. And these cells are then put into large-scale tanks called bioreactors, which are pretty much like a brewery, but instead of brewing beer, it's brewing meats and seafood. And we feed these cells with liquid nutrients that convert these cells into the actual tissue, muscle, fat, connective tissue, and real meat at the end of the day that has the same taste, nutrition, and eventually the same texture and look as well.
Compared with farm seafood, these cultured versions are friendlier to animals and the planet. Shiok Meat says growing cultured seafood is also at least 6 times faster than farming them. But it's pricey. A kilogram of cultured shrimp costs nearly $1,000 US. The key reason? The liquid nutrient solution that helps the seafood to grow is an expensive pharmaceutical product used to make things like vaccines.
When we started off, the liquid nutrient mix that we used to feed our cells used to be pharmaceutical grade because that was the only thing available out there. But what we have managed to do in 2.5 years is to swap out some of the chemicals with plant extracts or edible products that makes the food more nutritious and delicious as well. And eventually our process will involve 100% plant-based and edible nutrients. And we are aiming to be at about $50 per kilogram by the end of this year.
The company also faces another hurdle: how to make this novel lab-grown food appealing to customers.
We're looking forward to sort of breaking the myths that are out there and making people understand that this is the future and it's as safe for them as possible, and it's the same meat and seafood that they're used to eating.
Shiok Meats has raised over $20 million in funding and plans to launch their products within the next 2 years. Yet it might still take years, even decades, for cultured meat and seafood to go mainstream. But Shriram remains hopeful.
So our mission is to feed the 10 billion that we will be in the next couple of decades and the ever-growing population after that. As a consumer, you walk into a supermarket and you go to the frozen aisle of meat and seafood, and you see everything from cell-based meat and seafood to plant-based meat and seafood, and a small section of conventional meat and seafood. And that's sort of the vision for the entire industry and for Shiok Meats as well.
Coming up, sustainability on tap? We'll turn from food to drink and hear from beverage makers Heineken and Brewdog on their plans to cut their carbon footprint. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lines, and this is Bloomberg Green. We've talked about making the food we eat greener, but what about what we drink? Beer giant Heineken recently announced new carbon neutrality targets, hoping to reach net zero by 2030. It sees about 90% of its emissions coming from its suppliers, be that packaging or transporting or storing beer. Only about 10% actually comes from producing the drinks themselves. Our Danny Berger spoke to the company's CEO and started by asking about those goals and why now is the time to make the change.
Over the last 12 months, also as I transitioned into my new role, we started by a full strategy review, out of which came a couple of very clear strategic priorities for the next 5 to 10 years for the company, and we labeled them together under the banner of Evergreen. And one of those strategic priorities was a big step up in our sustainability and responsibility agenda. So it kind of really fit in the kind of strategic drumbeat of the company. But then on top of that, and more importantly, we really subscribe to this notion of the decade of action. that the world is at a crossroads, and where we all need to kind of lock arms to make sure that we address these big, both environmental and social challenges that the world is facing.
Is any aspect of this then being driven by maybe shareholders or even the consumer?
It's surprising how quickly things are changing in that regard. We really started on this genuinely coming from inside of the company literally about 12 months ago. Truth be told, being a 157-year-old company, this is something that the company has always been attuned to. As a brewer, we're deeply embedded in the local communities. When you build a brewery somewhere, it's going to be there for 50, 80, even over 100 years. So we always have realized that we can only thrive if the communities and the environment in which we operate thrives. But then, over these last 12 months, I've noticed a remarkable acceleration in how the external stakeholders, like investors, like consumers and customers, are really engaging on this topic. So it seems to be an auspicious moment in the world to really lean into this.
What would you say to critics who say that phrase carbon neutrality can only be used when it's the entirety of emissions, and to use it on just such a small portion could be seen as a form of greenwashing?
Yeah. Now, let's be very clear. We started with a clear commitment to decarbonize the full scope, 1, 2, and 3, the full value chain by 2040. As we are part of the race to zero, we are the first global brewer to make a commitment to fully decarbonize by 2040. But we said if we want to do it, we need to lead by example. Before we put a lot of pressure on a lot of our partners in the value chain, we need to walk the talk ourselves and make sure that we decarbonize already fully by 2030. So it's really kind of a notion of different stages. We start by fully decarbonizing ourselves by 2030. In parallel, we start working with all our partners in our value chain to make sure we are fully decarbonized by 2040. Also, our sense of control on our own production, of course, being larger than on the other parts of the value chain. So no, I don't feel we're greenwashing in any way. Also, what's really important that these targets are science-based, that they're validated and audited by the SBTi, so that there's full transparency on this. They are very ambitious. As a brewer, you use a lot of electrical energy, but you also lose a lot of thermal energy for the heating and cooling in a brewery. Decarbonizing electricity, we know you can do it through solar and wind. Still not easy to do that with breweries in over 80 countries in the world, but we know it can be done. Decarbonizing your thermal energy, the heating component, much harder. We know technically it can be done, but we really will have to commit in a major way as a company, together with suppliers of equipment and what have you, to make sure that indeed we reach this commitment by 2030.
So you talked a lot about working with the suppliers. How does that exactly look? How do you work with the suppliers to help cut emissions in things like transportation and raw materials?
Yeah. So as a brewer, you use a lot of malted barley, you use hops, you use cans, you use bottles. So in those areas, we have major and very professional global suppliers, particular on glass and can and malt. There's 5, 6 major global players in each of these fields. They all are also making their own kind of commitments on decarbonization. And it's now really pulling together with our suppliers, but also as industries to really push for systemic change. In agriculture, it's about low carbon agriculture, working with our farmers all over the world. On your packaging, it's all about, for example, increasing the recycling rate on glass and on cans. The typical recycling rate on one-way bottle is around 45%. We want to see if we can push that to 75, 80%. In the US, those percentages are even lower. So there's still a big opportunity on that side. Cooling is important, so we're working on green fridges with our suppliers. So actually a lot can be done, a lot already is being done, and it's really a matter of scaling it together.
from one of the world's biggest beer companies to a newer player on the scene. Brewery and pub chain Brewdog says it isn't enough to offset your carbon footprint. It's got to go hand in hand with actually reducing emissions. Our Anne-Marie Hordern caught up with its CEO.
So the first thing we did, we calculated the carbon footprint of our business, and we put a plan in place that we called 24 to 0 to take that carbon footprint down to 0 of our owned operations. The second thing we did is we decided to double offset all the emissions that our business has. And I think offsetting is okay, but you've also got to focus on reducing the emissions. The two things have got to go hand in hand. But we decided that our carbon was our problem, so we didn't want to pay someone to offset this for us. So we bought 10,000 acres in the Scottish Highlands, where we're going to create our own forest, where we're going to plant over 7 million trees to take our carbon out of the air. So for us, this is a completely new way for a company to approach sustainability.
So you purchased a forest in Scotland. Your brewery is powered by wind. How hard is it for businesses to take, these are like quite creative ideas. How hard is it for a business to actually do that?
It's definitely challenging for business, but we are facing an existential climate crisis. Huge changes needed today, not in 2030, not in 2040. Carbon neutral by 2050 is a joke. It is way too late. So we wanted to hopefully inspire other businesses to kind of join us in this journey, but change needs to happen today. And we think it's okay for our business to die, but it's not okay for the planet to die. So we really wanted to do everything we could to set a new standard in sustainability. In the last 12 months, we've invested almost 50 million between on-site bioplant, which turns our spent malt into biomethane, which powers our system, making sure our complete business was powered by wind, electrification of our vehicle fleet, and we've now got about 10 electric vehicles on the road, as well as creating this amazing forest that's going to rewild 10,000 acres. I mean, that's an area as big as Manhattan that we're going to be planting with trees in northeast Scotland.
You're also looking to build a brewery in France and one in Asia as well. Is that to tackle climate change as well, to cut down on emissions when you're transporting your beer?
Yes, absolutely. And this is something that's been part of our strategy for a few years now. So we built our brewery in Columbus, Ohio to service the US market. We've got a facility in Berlin, Germany. We've got a facility in Australia, which just reduces the distance the beer has to go, but also the ingredients has to go. So in America, we use American malt. In Germany, we use German malt. So using local ingredients, and the beer has to go less distance between us and our customers, which has a massive impact on the carbon emissions of our business, meaning we put much less carbon in the air to get the beers to people in these countries.
What part of your supply chain was it the hardest to cut out emissions?
So supply chain is really, really tough. And if you look at carbon emissions, there's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And the mistake that a lot of companies make is they just count scope 1 and 2 carbon, so the carbon they emit directly themselves. 85% of our emissions were in our supply chain. So the vast majority of the carbon footprint of our business was in our supply chain. So we count that, and we also double offset that carbon as well.
When you're dealing with suppliers and parts of your supply chain, how do you know that what they're saying is legitimate?
It is a challenging space because there's not that in place at the moment. So many companies are prone to greenwashing. So many companies are prone to making claims which kind of don't quite stack up. And there's also kind of so much kind of smoke and mirrors in the space as well. So I think openness and transparency is so key. So we publish a report every 6 months that outlines the entire carbon footprint of the business and the things that we're doing to become more sustainable. And Professor Mike Berners-Lee also looks at that report to make sure he's happy. So it also has that kind of independent seal of approval as well.
That's it for this week's edition, but keep the conversation going. You can follow us on Twitter @Climate. I'm Kaylee Lines in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green.